Hello and welcome to LA Currents. I'm Ann Police. Once one of the world's largest oil producers, Los Angeles would like to become a leader in going green, and they are headed that direction. This is in part thanks to an effort to cap oil drilling within the city of Los Angeles. Joining us today is Erica Blyther. She is Petroleum Administrator. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
We're glad to have you on. Let's start with the big question. What's a petroleum administrator? What does that mean?
It's a very interesting question. So historically, as you mentioned, the city of Los Angeles was really one of the major population booms was when oil began in the 1800s, 1900s. Mm-hmm. So in 1892, Edward Doheny, and that's a very familiar name, drilled one of the first oil wells in what's now Echo Park. And so from there on, there was a huge population expansion. And there are many, many wells throughout. Some were productive, some were not. Mm-hmm. As the city became more developed and the city council was established and everything, they realized they needed to have someone to look at oil and gas leases. So in the 1950s and 1960s, the Petroleum Administrator position was created, and the focus was just on oil drilling. Over time, there was less drilling and production, and so the duties kind of faded away. But with the Aliso Disaster, as well as a lot of concerns about fracking, so the Aliso Disaster happened in 2015, and there was fracking that occurred in 2014, a lot of concerns about it, and Senate Bill 4, there was a realization that there needed to be a renewed focus on petroleum as well as natural gas and safety. And so this office is the Office of Petroleum Natural Gas Administration as well as safety. And so our goal is really to be in charge of oil information, be a repository for oil types of oil information. So it focuses on the drill sites, the pipelines, as well as refineries.
It's a lot. You're over a lot in Southern California. Tell us, what was the Aliso disaster what was it again?
So in 2015, Aliso Canyon, there are two gas storage fields that touch the city of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. Aliso Canyon in Council District 12 up to the north in the valley, as well as Playa del Rey, which is in Council District 11, right, very close to the LAX airport. Playa del Rey is much smaller, but the Aliso Canyon is quite large. The most part of it is in LA County. But when there was that leak that occurred in 2015, there were a lot of concerns for people. And so there was a large amount of methane that was released to the atmosphere. Mm. And so it took a while to cap the well. It took a number of different engineers to figure out how to cap the well. Mm-hmm. And they calculated how much methane was released, and there was a lot of concern for the neighborhood residents and people nearby because they felt as though they'd been exposed, headaches, nosebleed, a lot of material debris that was in their homes. And so there's a huge settlement with a gas operator, SoCalGas. Mm. So they're still working through some of those details.
Oh boy, okay. Now, looking at your background, you have a bachelor's degree in environmental science and policy from Duke, and then you went on to get a master's degree in environmental occupational health right here in Southern California, Cal State Northridge. You've always been passionate about the environment?
Yes, absolutely. So I grew up, I enjoyed doing science and things, and so my parents would buy me like microscopes and things for Christmas gifts, and I love looking at things, and so I always loved science. So I knew I wanted to do something science related. So of course, when I heard about the Earth's crisis, I became more and more concerned about things. So I studied environmental science in school. Really, really happy to be able to apply that to what I do every day.
And what was your first sort of jump into, as a professional, into the world of environmental science? What was the first job?
Well, the first job, I actually was able to work at waste management. And so I did a summer internship there. And so while I was working in school, but as a summer intern, I was able to work at waste management. I dealt with landfills.
Oh, okay.
So it was the air quality reports as well as wastewater and landfill, it's called leachate, but the liquid that comes out of landfill testing that. So I was able to.
And then working into petroleum and natural gas, is that something that's always sort of been like in the back of your mind, or is that something that is sort of new to you? Like this is where I can really make a difference.
I grew up in Los Angeles, and I grew up in what's Windsor Hills, so it was in Los Angeles County. Mm-hmm. But my parents used to actually get royalty checks from what was the Inglewood oil field. And at the time, it was Stocker Resources that operated it. There have been many different oil operators over the time, but oil's always been part of what we lived with. And so I remember driving to Fedco. You'd see the oil pumping up and down. Yep. You'd see the oil jacks pumping up and down, pump jacks. And so just always grew up. And then it was later on I realized what the health effects were. Where I went to school, there were people that had asthma. There were people who had these things. And so there are a large portion of communities of color that live near these oil sites. And so the reasons why I relate to redlining, homeowners loan corporation maps that were done years ago, but still kind of decide who lives where next to what hazards.
I had never assumed or never even thought about that the oil jacking, as you were saying, has anything to do with your health. How are the two related?
So there are a lot of concerns about the air quality impacts from oil drilling.
Mm-hmm.
So the concern is, of course, the oil itself. So oil's petroleum, those are carbon atoms, and some of them make shapes that are sometimes very destructive. So like benzene is a concern.
Mm-hmm.
While to organic chemicals, those are things that can cause cancer. Another big concern is the actual machinery that operates. And so sometimes that machinery, if it's diesel powered, that machinery can cause the diesel emissions that are known as carcinogens as well. Oh. So the black carbon, those are all particulate matter. Those are all things that can cause cancer. And so that's a concern for people. Another thing, of course, is the methane that is sometimes released. So when you drill for oil, you get natural gas too. So a lot of times oil and gas go together. Mm-hmm. But that natural gas, if it leaks, that causes a lot of environmental concerns. So methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas even than carbon dioxide. Some speculate as much as 84 times as powerful. Whoa. So it can really cause a lot of health, not only health effects in the short term, but in the long term in terms of climate change.
Sure, long term, absolutely. What is a typical day? You said your office is in the Office of Petroleum, Natural Gas, and Safety. What does a typical day look like for you?
Right. Well, no day is typical.
No, it's never the same.
Never the same. Always something different happening. So some days I start with meetings with the refineries. So they usually will have quarterly meetings with the community that's interested, and they give updates on their operations. Mm-hmm. Other times it's commenting on legislation. So I work with the California Air Resources Board as well with the California Geologic Energy Management. So a lot of times it's the state that's making a lot of regulations, but also meetings with South Coast Air Quality Management District. So they'll have different rules related to the drill sites or pipelines. And a lot of times it's commenting on legislation and seeing where that legislation applies to the city and how we can make it be most effective.
How many active oil sites are there right now in Los Angeles?
So there are currently 15 active drill sites. And so they're colloquially called drill sites, but drilling implies there are new wells being created. These are wells that have been around for a while, so they're existing drill or production sites where there's oil extraction occurring.
Okay.
And they're scattered throughout the city.
They are?
Yes. A lot of them are in Council District 15. They're also near the Port of Los Angeles. A number are also in Council District 5. And the drill sites just are where the oil happened to be naturally deposited.
Right. And are those sites privately owned and run?
Most of them are privately owned.
Okay. So I assume it's a hard sell to go in and say, hey, we'd love to cap this. How's the reaction been? Do you know?
There's been some concern. I believe that the oil operators, as well as SIPA, the California Independent Petroleum Association, as WISPA, Western Petroleum Administration, they are not interested in this. They're not happy with the idea of the city moving away from oil. Mm-hmm. There's also been a lot of concerns about local oil production and how that's going to affect the amount of oil supply that's available for cars, jet fuel, et cetera.
Right. Do you know, as I said in my introduction, we were once one of the world's largest oil producers. We handled a lot of oil production back in the day. Any numbers come to mind when we're talking about oil production currently here in Southern California?
So the oil production has gone up and down with pandemic. So it drastically stopped in pandemic because everybody stopped driving. So immediately there was a huge dip. But numbers approximately about 7,500 barrels per day of oil are produced, which sounds like a lot. But when you look at Texas, it's about 4.4 million barrels a day.
Oh.
So it's a very de minimis amount.
Right.
But I believe approximately 31% of the oil that's produced in California goes to the local refineries.
So it stays here?
It stays here. Yes, the oil that's produced here stays here. We also import quite a bit to be refined.
So what are your thoughts about the state of California going to electric cars? That would diminish the need for oil, very, very quickly. They're talking, 2035 is when they would like to, which is, obviously a ways off, a lot can change. But what are your thoughts when you hear things like that? Is that a solution or is that just more problem?
I think it's a potential solution. I think it has to be done in a way that makes sense. So it has to be affordable to everyone. It has to be reliable. And we recently had the whole power grid system. And so if every car is electric, it's something to consider. How will all the cars manage to function? Some things are not going to be able to be electrified quickly. So, for example, planes are not going to go to electricity anytime soon. So there's still going to be a need for oil for at least a few different types of specialized operations.
So when you go to the private owners of these oil drilling sites and you say, listen, we need to cut back, the ones who are, you said some are just completely not open at all to talking about that, minimizing their production or capping altogether. Has there been anyone who said, we see what your people are saying, and that we're moving towards maybe not having as much oil production coming from this particular well?
What we have seen in the city is that there are some drill sites that have chosen to discontinue operations. So, for example, the Jefferson drill site closed late last year, and there were certain conditions that were recommended through the planning. The city planning department puts together different mitigation, not necessarily mitigations, but zoning codes and their planning cases and what it's allowed, each drill site's allowed. And so, for example, they talk about fence height, any type of landscaping, the number of walls, if there's any type of air monitoring, that sort of thing gets recommended as planning conditions. And those conditions can sometimes be too onerous for operators to operate with, and so they choose to close production instead.
Oh, I see. So it's almost more expensive to keep it open based on what's now going to be required of them.
Right. And the cost of oil keeps changing. So depending on the cost of oil, sometimes it's not effective for them economically to do that.
So then what happens, say, to the Jefferson site? They're just going to close it down. Then what happens to that land?
Yeah, there are a lot of ideas about what can happen. So Fourth Avenue was also a site that was operating in the city of Los Angeles. It closed a few years back. And so that area is going to be redeveloped for housing. So they're going to look at doing remediation, making sure the soil's clean, talking, again, that's coordination with the water board, coordination with Department of Toxic Substances Control, et cetera, and making sure that the soil's cleaned up to a level where residences can be put there.
Is there a certain amount of time that you have to wait in order to build on top of what was once an oil drilling site, or not that much oil seeps into the soil to make it a problem?
It's a concern. So, as I mentioned, Edward Doheny built a well in 1892. Mm-hmm. So the closure procedures that were around then are very different than what's around today.
So some of yeah, I can imagine.
So some of the city has very old oil wells that have been built on, and there have been health effects and there have been concerns for people. So, for example, in Council District 1, some people just were finding wells in their backyard and front yard that were improperly capped. And so there's an example of that, Furman Street. And so it can be quite costly. And so sometimes those wells, again, being so old, there's no chain of ownership of where you can find someone who's responsible for recapping it or dealing with it. And so then we turn to the state, again, California Geologic Energy Management, and they have money for what's called orphan wells, or wells where there's no ownership chain, and they can make sure those wells are properly abandoned or properly taken care of.
What a mess. Just a paperwork mess, you know? So the ones that are being capped now, though, everything has been done as far as you can tell, as far as the laws that have been put in place in order to make it a viable site almost as quickly as possible once they cap a well. And they do all of the things environmentally that need to be done. So there's not a lot of time lost between the capping of the well and then the development of that land for that neighborhood.
Yeah,
it can happen fairly quickly.
Yeah, it can happen fairly quickly. And depending on the type of development that's going to happen there, it can happen even quicker. So there are some, especially if it's a lot of low-income housing or especially for supportive housing, they can push through things a little bit faster. So they're working on ways, because there's a huge housing crisis happening right now.
Oh, in Southern California, it's massive. Is that mostly what you're seeing as plans to go into places like that?
I've heard of that. Some it's housing, sometimes it's parks and things like that. So it all different ideas of what can be done there. Sometimes other industrial uses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's open because it's being rezoned.
It's being sometimes rezoned. Yeah, so that's what the oil ordinance is going to do, is going to look at those cases on a case-by-case basis, what can be there. Yeah. There are other ideas, too, about maybe using the wells for energy storage. So there are a lot of different ideas of ways that the land can be used.
Let's talk about that ordinance. It's in writing right now, yes, but it has to be seen by lots of other committees and government entities before it becomes anything. What is the language in this ordinance? What's it trying to achieve?
So for it to be a non-conforming land use, there's just city code is that there is a 20-year time frame for something to go away if it's determined to be non-conforming. So that's for adult bookstores or what have you. So that's what the process is now that the city is going through, is saying that oil production is a non-conforming land use. And so once that's in writing, then and that's agreed upon, then everyone will have 20 years to cease production. Now, what my group has been, or my office has been tasked with specifically, is what's called Amortization Studies. And so that's something to look at the time frame. And so that's really looking at the return on investment. And so it's looking at all the investment that went into developing the well sites and things, and then seeing what that break point or break-even point would be for the oil operators so they could recoup their investments.
Which leads me to another question. What happens to that land as far as ownership? Does the state, the county, who then buys it from the private owner?
That's a good question.
Okay, that's still good answer.
We're waiting to see. First of all, we just have to do the studies and find out when is the break-even point. So the idea is 20 years is what's going to be in the ordinance after it goes through all its different committees, council, back to being finalized through the attorneys and everything. And then at some point, our study will come out and it'll say either it's going to be also 20 years or maybe less. So a lot of people say, well, why are you waiting 20 years? Why aren't you doing 5 years like Culver City did? Well, Culver City is a different city. It has one oil operator, one oil field, and it already had on its books that oil was a non-conforming land use. So we're doing that now. The city of Los Angeles is in the process of making oil be a non-conforming land use. And we are also have to look at several operators. So there are over 200 plus oil operators for the wells. A lot of different drill sites. So we have about 26 oil fields that touch the city of Los Angeles. And a oil field is just a place where oil is deposited under sandstone, for example. A drill site specifically is where there's a collection of wells operated by a single operator. So it's a little confusing, but there's a lot of different terminology that has to be understood that's very unique to the oil field or oil world.
So there's the oil, is it the derrick? I don't even know, what is that called?
So a pump jack is, that's the one that looks like a grasshopper.
That looks like yes, right. So those can be almost individually owned.
Yes.
Just because you see a field of those doesn't mean that that's owned by one person.
Usually if it's a field, they're owned together, but there are some one-offs that are just in different locations.
And therefore you get 200 plus owners that you have to then
yes, and look at the chain of ownership. And so the state keeps a lot of those records. So again, the Geologic Energy Management Division keeps a lot of those records. So we're going to be looking at that, but they also keep it by well. So we're going to be doing well by well analysis of those records.
Are some of the wells being capped because they are done with oil? They're out.
Some are older and they're not as productive, so it's not worth it to operate them. Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So how long, and I'm asking you a question that maybe can't be answered, how long do you think the ordinance will be going from different agency, committee, and government entity before it will actually become the ordinance?
It looks like it's moving very well. So it was released in August, and we just last week had our City Planning Commission meeting. And next week we're scheduled, I say we the city, but it's Department of City Planning's ordinance, really. It's not mine, but we're working hand in hand with planning. But they are going to go to the Energy, Climate Change, Environmental Justice Committee next week, and I believe they're going to the Planning and Land Use Committee meeting also in October. So it's moving through the committee system, and then it will head to City Council, so possibly before the end of the year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's moving fast.
That is pretty quick.
Yes.
When it goes to those agencies, do they have an opportunity to change the language?
Yes. Okay. Make recommendations. And public comment is available at all of those different meetings.
Who's the owner of that ordinance? Who says, we appreciate what you had to say about this, this, and this, but here's a reason why maybe that's not possible or why that language won't work? Who is the sort of like the end person who makes those final decisions?
That's the City Planning Department, and they work with us sometimes if there are suggestions, if there are concerns about, say, maintenance or something, because we have some expertise, a little bit of expertise on the oil industry area and what's needed to make refinements and things like that. But they seek involvement from the community, and sometimes that's oil operators, sometimes it's also people who live in the area, sometimes it's stakeholders, activists. Stan DeLay has been very, very active in the whole oil phase-out process.
Sure. The biggest environmental concern in regards to the oil drilling in Southern California? You mentioned there's health concerns, there's long-term health concerns. Also, the environmental impact. Talk a little bit more about that. How does drilling for oil affect our environment, short-term as well as long-term?
Right. So my office became involved in the ordinance. So there was originally the council motion was 170447, and it was to look at land use codes as well as do a health report. Mm-hmm. So my office did a health report in 2019, and it surveyed all the health available information that was available at that time. And so since that time, since 2019, the report came out in July of 2019, since that time there have been a lot more local health studies confirming that there's a huge impact on communities and people who breathe that air. So asthma, headaches, nosebleeds, as well as long-term conditions with just affecting health. Mm-hmm. Environmentally, of course, there's a lot of concerns about climate change. And as I mentioned, with methane production, with the oil production, there are volatile organic chemicals, NOx, nitrogen dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. That's something that smells bad. And there was a big concern in Carson recently about hydrogen sulfide was causing a huge number of odor complaints. Hydrogen is sometimes part of the oil process, depending on the oil deposits and what's underground. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that can be a concern for a community. But again, the methane and what's being released is the biggest concern for driving climate change.
And what does methane do to our climate?
It is a reactive gas that can destroy the ozone layer and just really heat up the planet.
Okay, so it does have an effect on the temperature.
Yes.
Is there I'm sure there's been a study done, but is there a certain mileage around, say, the site as to the people who are affected?
That's initially how the idea started, was to have what was called setbacks. And so initially there was ideas of looking at a setback of where they would cease production throughout the city. So they were looking at different buffer zones, and so areas where oil could not be produced. Yeah. And so they looked at 3,200 feet, 1,500 feet, et cetera. But later on, City Council said, well, why are we looking at these setbacks? Let's just say oil in general is not something that's compatible with people. So they decided to just say throughout the city, we're going to phase out oil production.
Okay, we can't make it work with humans infringing on it in any way.
That was the decision of council, to change from a distance to just say everywhere is non-conforming.
I mean, I challenge anybody to find a place in Los Angeles that's not populated.
Los Angeles, there's no place where people live closer to oil than in Los Angeles. So Texas is more productive, right, but there's a lot of distance between people and the oil fields. Here, people literally are living right on top of the oil fields. They're in their backyards, front yards, yeah, right next door.
Absolutely. LA, as I mentioned, is trying to lead the charge in going green. There's a lot of different things that, not just in Los Angeles, but the entire state of California. In Los Angeles, though, are there other cities that you look towards, large metropolitan cities such as our own, that you go, you know what, they're really doing it right? Is there a blueprint maybe that you guys look at that comes from someplace else?
We're really on the leading edge for, I think, going green. I think the city of Los Angeles, California in general, yes, but definitely the city of Los Angeles is doing a lot of things. So we have the Green New Deal, we have what's called the Sustainable City Plan, but all of these are looking at ways to be greener. I know the mayor works a lot with C40, which is a group of different 40 cities that were really leading the way towards being green, mm-hmm, looking at ways of helping the planet, mm-hmm, and environmental sustainability. And so that whole coalition has been looking at ways, but really LA is really taking the lead in a lot of its initiatives and things that are occurring.
That's exciting, but it's also it's a lot. It's a big responsibility. It's like it would be much nicer if there was someone who was really doing it well, and we could just kind of sort of take those ideas. What other studies you guys working on there in your office? What other things are happening?
So I mentioned we deal with the drill sites, the pipelines, as well as the refineries. Yeah. So we get involved sometimes when the state has rules like assembly bills and things. So one of the assembly bills is Assembly Bill 1646, which is working with the refineries on emergency notifications. If there's some type of leak, spill, fire, et cetera, how to notify the surrounding communities. That I'm coordinating with the fire departments on that one. So we have our own LA City Fire Department, but we're trying to get a procedure in place because especially in the Port of Los Angeles, it's very close to be in Wilmington versus Carson. And so some of those refineries are really next to each other. So how do we communicate with each other? So we're working with LA County as well as El Segundo and Torrance on creating ordinances and a process in place for communication. Another assembly bill that we've been working on is Assembly Bill 617, and that's related to doing community air monitoring as well as emissions reductions in different communities. So Wilmington was one of the first AB 617 communities chosen in the state, and it's really looking at some of the most polluted areas, and they use Screen, which is a science-based mapping tool that's really looking at how are these people impacted, what can we do to reduce the impacts, and so working with AQMD on that program. It's a state program, but it's been delegated to the local air district. So here it's the South Coast Air Quality Management District. And so working with Wilmington, Carson, West Long Beach, they've actually done a lot of air monitoring near drill sites, near production, near refineries, and found things that are concerned. And it's great because they're working hand in hand with their compliance team. So when they find something, they also go ahead and talk to their compliance team and follow up, and if necessarily make corrections, hopefully in real time. They're going to do that also in South LA. That's another community, that's a Year 3 community, and there's also oil production in those areas. So those are the ones I've been interacting with. And hearing what those community members have said is they really would like to have 24/7 monitoring. So we recently have begun a climate equity fund, and that was started. This is another thing that my office does, is we deal with the pipeline or franchises. And so the pipeline franchise is, it's basically a contract to operate within the city. So when we lose land, not the use of the land rather, then we have a franchise fee. And so sometimes it's based on length of pipeline, sometimes it's based on gross receipts. So recently, last year, we were able to negotiate a new franchise agreement with SoCalGas. And part of that was to give us a certain amount of money set aside for a climate mitigation or climate equity fund. And so some projects related to that are going to be related to doing things like doing air monitoring at the drill sites, creating a compliance database so we're aware of all the activities that are occurring at the drill sites so the community's not concerned, and working on a website for my office. So we want to have a new website.
You got to work on that website. It's always a thing. It's like, oh, I got to do that now too.
Yeah, but just to communicate so people have access to. So the biggest cry that I've heard from the AB 670 community is air monitoring. They want to know what's happening on a regular basis, 24/7 at the different drill sites. So we are going to try and get a program to get air monitoring up at the drill sites. And then that will be housed on the website so people can log on at any time and see what's going on. This is a long-term plan, but that's a big concern for the community.
It's in the works.
It's in the works. We're working on it.
And the communities, when you identify some of those communities, like you mentioned Wilmington, South LA, community members come out. They are concerned.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. They're very active. They're very concerned about things. So it's a lot of local residents. It's a lot of environmental justice communities, a lot of environmental groups who have formed, and they're really concerned about what's the impact on their health and long-term, what's going on.
Grassroots, that's where change starts.
Absolutely.
We'll look forward to seeing that brand new shiny website when you get it up and rolling. In the meantime, folks who have questions and want more information can log on to the website. You see it there on the screen. It's dpw.lacity.org, and they can find everything they need on there until your new website shows up.
Yes.
Erica, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate being here.
This has been LA Currents. I'm Ann Police. We'll see you next time.